We are officially live, everybody. Joshua Hatton here with ImpEx Beverages, and welcome to our fourth of 5 ImpEx Distillery Deep Dive live streaming sessions. I want to welcome anybody who's signing on via Facebook, and then, of course, anybody who's signing on via YouTube. We're definitely happy to have you. On today's Distillery Deep Dive, we're going to be focusing on Japanese whiskeys, and we're going to be leaning pretty heavily on Chris Uhde, who's been my Japanese whiskey mentor, guru for a while, and I feel as if I forget more than he could ever know. He's got so much Japanese information locked up in his head, so this is going to be a real treat. So let me bring in Mr. Uhde. How are you, sir?
I'm good. I'm trying to open the Facebook thing on another tab. I feel like an old man trying to work a calculator.
Yeah, I don't know how that stuff works and how you do it. You got to be a man of a certain age, but an age down there, and I'm up here.
That's right. I'm there with you, buddy.
And then, of course, Sam Filmus. I brought him in mid-sip. How are you, Sam?
Pretty good, enjoying it. And yes, Mr. Uhde, I beat you here. I did get on my Facebook and I muted it, and it works. So if you need some directions, you know what to call.
And you did all that and you had time to take a sip of whiskey.
Yeah, because you gave me these directions a couple of weeks ago and I followed them, and now you're in trouble, so I can pay you back.
I'm posting now.
Well, I want to bring in our special guest. We've got Susannah Skiver Barton, and here she is in all her glory. Susannah, welcome.
Such as it is. Thank you. Thank you for saying my name correctly.
Why? What do people normally say?
Sometimes the Skiver comes out as Skiver or Skeever.
Oh, Skiver.
Yeah.
No,
but
Skiver.
It is Skiver, which in Scotland means a lazy person, and I want everyone to take note of that. I am a Skiver.
Yeah, through and through, huh?
Absolutely.
So we were trying to figure out what your title was, right? We had Ralphie on, and his title, I think he was just, a vlogger extraordinaire. And then we had the Cask Chasers on, and of course they're podcasters. And then you came on, and Chris said, Chris, what was the title that you gave Susannah? Something to do with a queen.
I don't know, some like badass queen of whiskey writing or something. I can't remember now. Yeah. But it's
I like it.
If you take any, you get where I'm going with it. So take a set of words that kind of means that she's one of the best in the industry, and put those words together with a title and set it next to her name, and I think it works.
And the title would be The Queen.
The Queen.
You can call me anything, but don't call me late for dinner.
Well, Susannah, thank you so much for joining us and being part of the conversation. We really appreciate it. And it's just been too long since we shared a drink in person, and hopefully now with vaccines in us, we can make all that happen sometime.
I would be into that. Yeah, thank you so much for having me here. I'm very excited. I have a random assortment of Ohishi and Fukano whiskeys around, and I am just starting with some standard Ohishi brandy cask matured.
Can you show us that glass again?
It's mini because you can sample many different things. The smaller your Glencairn, I did give myself a generous portion here, but it's a perfect dram. It's like a little half-size Glencairn, so that I can have many different things without,
there you go,
overdoing it on any one. I have a whole bunch. I'm ready. I'm ready. I'm not reusing glasses here tonight.
Love it.
Fresh glass for every pour.
So, and by the way, just so everybody knows what I'm drinking, I've got the Matsui Sakura cask. I don't know if you could see that. So that's what's in my glass right now. Chris, in our last distillery deep dive, we had Laura and John from Penderyn, and Tal from Milk and Honey, and then of course you talking about Japanese whiskey, and so that one was a focus on world whiskeys. And your biggest comment, which has been rattling around in my head since for the past 2 weeks, is Japanese whiskey is still trying to figure out what it's going to be when it grows up. That cracked me up, but that's kind of telling, right? Considering you've got, when you look at this label, well, you can't see it, it's a bit blurry, but there's a 1910 on this label, right? That's 111 years. And you would think that other distilleries, Yamazaki or Suntory at 1922, 1923, whatever it is, you think they've all kind of grown up and know what they are. And so I'm going to throw a question at you. When it comes to the Japanese whiskey category, you've got a bunch of different things. You've got Japanese whiskey blends, but unlike, say, a Scottish blend, you can incorporate whiskeys from other countries in there and still call it a Japanese blend. You've got pure malts, which is similar to blends. You can incorporate malt whiskeys from other countries. And you've got single malt, that's what I'm having. Everybody knows what single malt whiskey is. Malt whiskey from a single distillery, and this distillery is Matsui. So Japanese single malt, 100% whiskey from Japanese origin. And then something that you started bringing into the States just a few years back, brands like Ohishi and Fukano with rice distillate, and it's made with koji. It's whiskey made in a completely different way than most people think about. And so here you are. I said it before. You're my Japanese whiskey guru. You have the ImpEx portfolio as your palette and your paintbrush. Tell us the story. How do we understand the category of Japanese whiskey? How did the distilleries tell it? How should they tell it? And how should we, as importers of whiskeys in this category, help tell that story? I know, long question.
That's okay. I just want to answer it. It's geez. So how do you unpack all that, right? First off, the 1910 on that bottle, back then, those guys weren't making whiskey. Those guys were making either sake or shochu or something, right? So a little bit of a younger history for that particular distillery. But, the first whiskey license in Japan was issued like 1918, 1919. So when you take a look at that and you think about the history of using the vocabulary of whiskey and distillation in Scotland and in America, and how that goes back several hundred years further, it's Japanese whiskey still is in its adolescence, right? I would think. Now, as far as what it's going to be, that's going to be up to politicians here soon, I imagine, because there's been statements of intent that have been released from different private organizations, and they are going to be what they are. But what I guess more of the way that I would have to speak of it is I would have to speak of it as a whiskey fan and what I would hope it could be. And I have to speak of it strictly, not in a professional sense, but simply as a fan of whiskey. And the reason why is because, at the end of the day, it's whatever that country decides, it's their right to tell them what they can and can't do, what they should and shouldn't do. But I can tell you as a whiskey fan, the way that I think of Japanese whiskey to myself is a multitude of things, right? I think it's a history based on blending, a history based on distilleries make different styles of whiskey within a single distillery, right? We talked about this at the last one, but if you look at a single malt, you'll hear single malt producers say, this is our style of whiskey that we make, and they're talking about what they make all the time. They might say we do a peated run, but if they're doing if it's a Speyside distillery and they're doing a non-peated run, they talk about their style of whiskey as an all-encompassing thing. And in Japan, if you look at the history of distillation of different distilleries over there, they were literally making different styles of whiskey within a single facility to then be able to produce different types of blends later. Does that make sense? So it's a history of blending. it's a wonderful history of blending that has now got a spotlight on it. And so people are trying to figure out how to establish the price. But as an enthusiast, I hope that when it grows up, it becomes a massive army of different flavors, of different styles of distillation, so that it can really, pack a big wall. Does that kind of make sense? So you have your malt producers, the rice whiskey stuff that Sam and I do, the Koji whiskeys. They are kind of unique and until their own. And 1 second, Sarah, can you? Yeah. So sorry, I got a bunch of ringing knock on the warehouse here that I can't hear myself think. That's kind of a different breed, and it's a breed that's very old, right? Like it dates back to the 1800s in America, and we can talk about that a little bit later. But it's a wonderful style of distillation, and it's already being mimicked outside of Scotland. Like you have Whistlepig, who did one. Lot 40, I think, did one as well, like Koji-based whiskeys. And so I would like to see that incorporated as well. But again, I can't say what it should or shouldn't be because, again, I'm not Japanese. However, as a whiskey enthusiast, I hope it becomes something all-encompassing so that you can have all these different styles of whiskey within it. I don't know if I answered your question at all, but
no,
there we go.
I think you started to, but I just want to touch on one thing really quickly, and then Susannah, I'll gladly hand it over to you. You started talking about Koji whiskeys and the use of Koji within whiskey production, not just within Ohishi and Fukano, but you brought up some American distilleries. I think there's likely a number of people watching this that don't fully understand A, what Koji is, B, how you would even use it within the production of whiskey, and C, what it does for the whiskey. Why are they using it? So can you touch on what Koji is and what it does, why it does it?
Yes. So Koji is pretty simple, right? It's when you go to ferment something. Let me just back it up a second. And when you go to ferment something, like if you're going to make a bourbon, you'll put some malted barley in there because it has an enzyme called alpha amylase, and that helps the fermentation. That helps with the yeast to feed on the sugars inherent in the grain, and it helps for a healthy fermentation. If you're not using a malted barley, and Susannah can speak to this, she's going to know way more about it than I will. Then you have different producers using enzymes. They're basically pitching in enzymes to help the yeast to stay healthy so it can feed off the sugars. And Koji is just another way to get those healthy enzymes. Koji is known as Aspergillus orgeat. And remember, guys, I'm from Georgia. My accent, and it's different, so I'm probably not saying it right, but just bear with me. And that enzyme, the Koji, what it does is you sprinkle the Koji onto whatever grain you're going to ferment, and you let it sit for about 40 hours in a controlled room, and it basically sprouts on that grain, and it gives you that Aspergillus orgeat, the enzyme that you need for that healthy fermentation. And it actually starts with fermentation as well. And they use it for, you don't just have to use it for fermentation, for distillation. You use it for all types of fermentation. So if you guys have ever had soy sauce, you've had Koji incorporated into your cuisine. Miso soup at a sushi restaurant, you've had Koji incorporated into it. There's now, I think there's actually a Jewish deli on the East Coast using it to dry age meat because they can sprinkle it on there, and it gives some of the same characteristics as letting stuff just sit in a dry aging cellar for a while. It gives it nice umami. At home, my wife at home, she'll put it onto pork chops and let it sit for a couple of days. She'll spend a few weeks making it, the Shio Koji, and then she'll put it on the pork chops, let it sit, and it gives us this nice, wonderful umami characteristic. And when you incorporate that into fermentation and distillation, you gain a few things that are kind of unexpected. One is you reduce the level of methanol in your ferment. So the way it's been explained to me, and again, I'm not a chemist, but the way it's been explained to me is, if you, like over there, they'll distill with potatoes, and potatoes have higher peptides, so they'll get a higher concentration of methanol. And if they feel like they're getting that, they can just sprinkle more Koji onto it, and it removes those peptides, so you get a cleaner ferment. And so when they incorporate it into the whiskey side of things, you basically get a better yield on your grain than you would of if you had done it via the malting process, right? If you do malted barley and corn, you get a better yield out of the corn if you just add some Koji to the corn than you do from just having the malted barley there. So you get a higher yield, you get a cleaner fermentation, you get less off flavors. Like the Ohishi and Fukano use stainless steel pot stills. They don't have any copper in there. And as all the people watching this in whiskey know, A lot of people like to use copper to pull off the off flavors, what are they, off conagers or whatever.
Yeah.
But you don't need it because they're not there. They just simply don't exist. Like the first drop, there's no heads. The first drop that comes off the still is consumable. So there's no methanol in it whatsoever.
Amazing.
You don't have to take that first 5%. And that's kind of what koji does. But if you just want a standard translation, koji translates into a type of mold, basically. But it is a type of mold that is a wonderful thing. And it dates back like 9,000 years in Asian cuisine. And it's something that we're starting to adopt it in the Western world, but we're just not there yet. But when we are, you're going to see it popping up more and more and more and more in cuisine and in fermentation, I think. But it's a wonderful way of skinning a cat versus just using malted barley, if you will. You like skinning cats?
Well,
I'm joking, Joshua. I'm joking.
I was laughing earlier because you led with there's a Jewish deli that uses the koji, and then quickly followed that up with, and my wife puts it on her pork chops. Like from Jewish deli to pork chops was great.
Of course, because it's the universal thing.
I want to know which scholar, which Talmudic scholar was arguing the, kosherness of koji in and of itself. Is it inherently kosher, or does it have to be produced in kosher conditions, under the supervision of a rabbi? Very curious.
Yeah.
I'm curious about that too, because I guess it's plant-based, right? So it would automatically be okay until it's not okay.
Well, it's a fungus. I don't know. Where do fungi fall in the kashrut, rules?
I know.
Are they handled? Are they discussed?
Well, we have Jason Johnston Yellen watching. I know he looks like a rabbi these days, but he's not a rabbi, so he can't really answer that. But before we move on, Suzanne, I didn't know if you wanted to add anything or inquire further into what Chris was saying about various Japanese categories or koji.
I think the elephant in the room. Maybe we're going to discuss this a little more as we go through the conversation. But Chris very delicately sort of referred to people coming out with their own ideas about Japanese whiskey. I assume you were referring to the labeling standards that were issued a couple months ago, Chris, that are voluntary, that were issued by a trade group. And a lot of people in Western, sort of among Western whiskey lovers, certainly the reporting I've seen has mostly glossed over the fact that they're voluntary, and that there still isn't a government mandated official definition for Japanese whiskey, and there's no timeline for that happening. It could happen, but there's no guarantee of it happening. So, when we talk about, Josh, you opened the conversation by saying there are Japanese blends that also include imported distillate and pure malts, do the same thing. I think a lot of people saw the news about the labeling standards and said, well, that's not happening anymore. Everything from now on is, if it says it's Japanese, it's going to be 100% made in Japan, but there's no guarantee that will happen. It's relying on the good faith and transparency and honesty of the, voluntary members of this trade group. And I don't know, there's no way to enforce it. So I just wanted to acknowledge that that's the reality. And a lot of people think it's been put to bed, but it's still very much an open question in my view.
Is that just to be clear, because I read that and it was a really short document, but remind me and remind our viewers here, who made up that group or that consortium that came up with this document to revise the labeling system for Japanese whiskeys?
It's the document comes from the Japan Spirits and Liqueurs Makers Association. I don't know anything about the association. You can find a list of its members on its website.
And that's what I wanted to know. Yeah, who the members were.
Oh, I'm pretty sure like Nika and Tottori both I think are in there, and obviously anyone coming up labeling standards for Japanese whiskey is going to be inclusive of the two leading distillers of Japanese whiskey. So no, I don't want to say I know, who's involved and I don't want to speculate about their motives either, but I want it to be very clear that these are entirely voluntary. There's no way to legally enforce them in Japan, let alone in export markets. So I wouldn't necessarily expect to see blends that include imported distillate disappear from America's retail stores. So, I mean, time will tell. We'll see. We'll see if it causes a shift among producers or not.
What are your thoughts on that, Chris?
Well, Matsui signed up for it, so they've signed up for it as well. Again, I'm of the opinion, and I say I, but really I think Sam and I both are of the opinion that with like now I'll put on my ImpEx hat, and anything that ImpEx does as far as whiskey is concerned is we just want it to be good whiskey. It's pretty cut and dry, right? And we wouldn't have dipped our toes into this pond if we didn't think it was deserving of being included in that category, right? Like in doing something that qualified as whiskey for export market, that was a pretty big step to take, and we felt it should be taken simply because the whiskey that we were bottling, in our opinion, and in a lot of reviewers' opinions, is great. So we should be inclusive of it. If I spoke on it as far as like where it's going to go, what's going to happen, the motives and everything there, I would give a motive as to why to push back against the way it's written right now is fine, except for they need to there's just a few little changes to be made, right? Like one of it says all of the grains have to be malted. Well, that's simply not going to happen, right? Because how are you you're not going to be putting malted corn into anything. You're going to have malted barley mixed into it, but I don't think you're going to be malting corn to add it to the mash, right? And then saying that koji, and that's another way to try to say that koji can't be used, and I think that would be a mistake. And the reason why I think it would be a mistake is pretty much as follows. And that is, 10 years ago, there were 1,000 different distilleries in Japan using koji for whatever they were distilling. Now there's 852, or right about in there. So in the last 10 years, we've seen a 15% decline in the number of independent distilleries operating using that fermentation style as part of what they're doing. And so at the average of 15 family businesses a year closing down over the last decade, to exclude the remaining 852 that exist out of a category that could potentially be a big boon and a big cultural connection between Japan and the rest of the world by incorporating some of the same vocabulary, I'm of the opinion that that's just a little bit short-sighted. I think that there's a way to do it where they can be inclusive of everyone that's over there, and like a rising tide to carry all the ships, right? Be inclusive of everyone that's over there, while at the same time establishing what the people who have the statement of intent written now want to establish. There's a way to get all of that packaged up nice and clean, so that the consumer also can be very, very much aware as to what they're purchasing. There's a way to get that done. Again, I hope that they put all that together, but again, it's not really our place to say. But that would be my pushback. Is like, imagine, just like really sit back and imagine how awesome it would be if you had not just the people who have the whiskey licenses over there, but you had the other 852 distilleries that are using koji process, all innovating and all trying to, I mean, for better, for worse, like do their own thing, or even one up each other, or see what the other one's doing and see how they can play off of it. Like, imagine the expansion of offerings that can be made available that way, or where it could really take whiskey, especially whiskey out of Japan, into like a brave new world of flavor profile, right? Because we know that Japanese malt whiskey is awesome. We've all tried it. We all love it. Like they've whether you're talking about blended malts, pure malts, single malts, like it has been tried and true that they have got that on lock. They are very, very good with it. So let's take that. That is so wonderful. And then let's expand out the flavor profile as well. I saw a question from Chris Wingate. Do you think it's the koji or the rice that gives it such a silky mouthfeel? Well, it's a little bit of both. And when you incorporate it into barley, by the way, because Sam and I have a few casks of whiskey that was made with koji, but barley as well. It translates over there, but it's even completely different than that. So you'll have koji rice, which is one way. Then you have malted barley, which is one way, and then you have koji malt, or I'm sorry, koji barley, which is it's a different point on the star of flavor profile. So it can just really expand out. And that's all I got to say about my soapbox, man. Like, that's the way I look at it, right? Like, light them up. Let's have some fun with it.
I want to interject from the perspective of a person who's not in, I don't have a financial stake in this. I don't sell these whiskeys. I just enjoy them. And I'm a writer, and Chris knows this. I've been actively working on a couple of stories about koji whiskey. So it's been on my mind a lot lately. What I think, Japan's spirits industry is perhaps not valuing enough is how utterly uniquely Japanese the koji process is. I mean, and that they control the conversation here. I know there are other cultures and people and cuisines and things that use koji, but it really is, it's the national fungus, it's the national mold of Japan. You can celebrate its day on October 17th.
Wait, are you serious? There's a koji celebration day.
Yes. And I don't know what the festivities are like, but knowing how Japanese people, celebrate some of these treasured cultural icons, I'm sure they're fabulous and delicious. And koji is prized for all of its applications in Japanese cuisine and food and drink. But here we are looking at this opportunity that's already proven itself, because there's been such a positive response among Americans who have gravitated towards these offerings just in the last 5 or 6 years that they've even been on the market. It's a huge opportunity for, as Chris was saying, for Japan to step forward, claim this heritage that they more than any other nation or culture really have, the bona fides to claim, and say, yes, we are proud of this. This is a uniquely Japanese process, and it makes a uniquely Japanese spirit. And we're gonna, we'll call that spirit whiskey, right? Because it has been put in a barrel, it has been aged. It's no longer shochu or awamori or whatever it's classified as when it's not this barrel matured. And I don't know. Yeah, I don't know anybody, anyone in the trade association or in the Japanese spirits trade, but I sure hopes there are people out there agitating for the inclusion of this style to be recognized as Japanese and as whiskey, to ensure that that someone else doesn't come along and and kind of adopt it, because you could do the koji process anywhere. And I have no doubt some enterprising craft distiller, or many of them, multiples in the United States, are already working with koji. I'm sure there is someone out there already doing it to make bourbon, or maybe American single malt, or maybe a rice whiskey. And if you let the Americans, take control of the conversation, like that's letting go of a lot. I say that with love in my heart. I want to see American craft distillers using koji. I would love to see that, but I also want to see the Japanese spirits industry take the amount of pride in what it's already doing that I think it has earned and deserves.
Well, I bought a lottery ticket yesterday, and I haven't checked my numbers yet, but if it hit, I can promise you, next thing I'm gonna do is open up a distillery in the United States, and I'm gonna fly everyone in from Japan and let them make it over here. And I'm going to claim it and be like, I brought this guy in from this prefecture, this guy in from this prefecture, and this lady in from this prefecture, and they all made it. We got the barrels, and I'm going to sit on them and just say, excellent. But
I'm not going to name any names, but I was talking to a very prominent American craft bourbon distiller not too long ago who voluntarily, I didn't even bring this up, brought up koji and said, yeah, we want to get into that. And I was like, let me know when you do. And I'm sure they're not the first. So we'll see.
With koji in mind, this is a two-parter. I remember, Chris, you and I talking months back, maybe it was last year, maybe it was 2 years ago. I really don't remember. Doesn't matter. But you were saying one of the interesting things about Japan was while the rest of the world was distilling grains and making a product called whiskey, Japan was a closed-off society. And that whiskey never really traveled to Japan. Meanwhile, they were doing their own distillation, and had they been an open culture, then maybe what they were doing may have, you may have assigned that same moniker of whiskey to what the Japanese are doing. But because the history started different, their distillate had one moniker that carried on one way, and the rest of the world had another moniker, again, also assigned to a distilled grain product that became whiskey throughout the world. And so do you think a lot of the argument now is people's just understanding of what that word whiskey is? Do you think Japan being a closed society 200 years ago is having detrimental effects, 2 centuries later?
So vocabulary, like sharing vocabulary, does help too. Well, yeah. So clearly, the answer is I don't know if it's a detrimental effect. I just think that if you unpack it this way, right? Like if you look at single malt Scotch whiskey, and then you were to look at rye whiskey, and you were to pour a guy who didn't know anything about any of them, the two of them, they're going to look at you, and then you pour them a glass of rum, right? Like a glass of properly aged rum. What are they going to show? Like if you say which two of these are the same thing, as far as from a vocabulary standpoint, they didn't know anything about any of them. Now I get that's hard to find, but if you do that, I don't think they would necessarily associate rye and single malt together, especially like a bourbon cask single malt or a peated single malt rather. Bourbon cask is a heavy pickled rye whiskey versus like a Barbados rum, right? They might put those two together instead of the peated whiskey with it. So when you think about it that way, like, would we have called, like, if rye had been done in Japan first and it was that way, would they have called it whiskey if they weren't trading that vocabulary or that ideas? And my argument would probably be not, because when you do look at it that way, you had a closed off society. You just basically had the processes kind of going at the same time, like the education happening at the same time when trade wasn't happening. It makes sense they'd come up with their own words for it, and it makes sense that those words wouldn't then be shared. But then later on, when they are shared, let's just really take a look at it for what it is, right? They just reaffirmed in Japan that shochu can't be bottled at a dark color. So that law has been locked in for they think another 10 years at least. So what we are bottling as whiskey clearly can't be called shochu, but it is, I mean, it just is whiskey. So why not, right? Why not allow that vocabulary exchange to happen so that we can just communicate, right? Like it's just a form of communication. So yeah, I think it did come back to bite a few people in the backside, but but I think that if what I really think is if prohibition hadn't happened in the United States when it did, I think American whiskey would have a kind of a different face to it, where we would have some people using malt and some people using koji as well, because there was a distillery literally built to do the koji process in Peoria, Illinois, back in the 1800s, and they were doing it, and the only reason why they went under was simply because, one, prohibition was kind of on its way. You had the teetotalers based out of that same region that were kind of putting pressure on it. Plus, you had, sorry, my computer's giving me trouble. Plus, you had the company that was funding it go into receivership, and they didn't go into receivership because of that distillery. They went into receivership because of some other shady stuff that they were doing. Plus, they like money was disappearing out of the organization, right? So if that had not happened, who's to say that wouldn't have been where our industry, the American industry, would have started to shift over towards. And so there you go, right?
Yeah.
Does that make sense the way I'm thinking about it? I realize I might not be clarifying it, but if you think about like the fact that you can already incorporate that into the whiskey making process in the United States, why not allow it to carry the word whiskey if they're using that process in another country? Does that make sense?
For me, I think it makes perfect sense, right? You've got, when did you say that dates back to? The late 1800s?
Yeah. 1892 is maybe like one of the first references of the Japanese whiskey process. It predates, like, the Katsuda-san wasn't even born yet when that article came out in the Peoria Herald. So it's
Yeah.
like it's just weird, right? It's just weird. Like, it's like, look at it at its very basic essence, right? The 3-year-old age statement. In Scotland, it's not whiskey till it's 3 years old. We don't have that same regulation here. And other people are kind of honoring, like, they're going to try to incorporate that into the statement of intent for the Japanese stuff, which is great. But that's a trade of idea from Scotland to go over there, and they're bringing it into it. We haven't even brought that over to here, where we have, like, however many hundreds of whiskey producers we have. Mm-hmm. So it's really just the word is like a forms of communication more than anything else. And so let's use it to be able to effectively communicate.
Chris, I have a question for you.
Uh-oh.
I'm curious. I mean, Ohishi and Fukano, you brought them in. Don't worry. I'm gonna ask
He's hiding behind the ImpEx sign. That's great.
You had the vision to recognize these products as whiskey when you first tasted them, right? And they were sort of lingering in this limbo where they couldn't be bottled as shochu unless they were filtered to be much lighter in color, and that would strip a lot of their flavor. And the producers, Oi-san and Fukano-san, didn't have a market for these things. But you said, I have a market, I can sell them, people love them, and you were right. In Japan, even if it's just among the producers of these whiskeys, is there, or let me say these spirits, is there coming to be a recognition, or has there always been a recognition that these are whiskey? I mean, how does Oi-san or Fukano-san or the actual distillers and producers of these spirits, how do they regard them? What do they think of them as? So
that is a mixed thing, and I'll get to it in a second, because it's funny. A lot of people mentioned my name in this, but let's just be real. The only, like, Sam bankrolled the whole damn thing, and I conned him into letting me go to Japan. So he tried it, and he was like, "Yeah, let's do this." And I was like, "Okay, man, I'm heading over there. I'll go talk to him." And then it's just snowballed into, all of a sudden it's my face and everything. But, like, behind the scenes, he's being all quiet. But let's be clear about that, right? Because I would have bought like 5 bottles, and Sam's like, "No, we can let's actually do this." But
so you're saying Sam is the brains and you're just the mule, right?
If you guys haven't figured out, if any of you have watched more than one of these, I think it's pretty obvious that like, when the magician is running his magic and he's got the monkey and the clowns jumping over and doing somersaults, I do a pretty mean flip. Like, I'm look over here, and Sam's over there, like, just making it all work.
Chris, all credits go to you. Japanese part of the portfolio. When you call me in the middle of the night, "Oh, I like this cask. Can we just bottle as a single cask? Let's not put it in a batch." What do you want me to tell you if you're so excited? Of course, I would say yes. No problem.
Yeah, it actually goes, "Do you know what time it is?" And yes. And then I'm like, "Oh yeah, it's kind of late." So it's starting to, right? Because there is historically, no, it was recognized. I'd like to think that it was recognized as a threat, because the shochu laws about the color were implemented at the exact same time that a some regulations were implemented that eased tariffs on whiskeys coming into Japan. So clearly, I've talked about this in other things, but there was a $6 billion trade deficit between the UK and Japan, and Margaret Thatcher formed a coalition to go over there and renegotiate Scotch whiskey import tariffs to try to get a better market share to even out some of that deficit of trade. And when they passed the laws that the Thatcher Soze, as they call it, that Kaiser Soze, the Thatcher Soze that lowered the tariffs of whiskey going into Japan, Tim Grimes, grim times with Tim Grimes. When they did that, they at the same time they passed the laws that made it illegal to bottle shochu at a dark color, and they did that specifically. I think, like, this is again just some dude talking, but I think that was a move that was done to specifically try to separate out the categories, right? Because it was almost, without acknowledging it, it was acknowledged that, hey man, this looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, and it's a pretty powerful duck because it is delicious. We need to behead that duck. So they did it by making shochu. Shochu's kind of its own wonderful thing as well, by the way. It's probably one of my favorite drinks. And so I have to say that's kind of an acknowledgement without actually acknowledging. And then you fast forward to now, there's actually a retailer in Japan who's applying for a trademark on the word Koji whiskey, and he's started to bottle up stuff over there to sell it as Koji whiskey. So I'm still unclear as to how I still don't know how he's been able to work out the licensing side of that, because that was a hiccup that we ran into back in 2014. But so I like to think that if it's those bottles come out as good as I think they can come out, it's going to help raise awareness and like raise the power of the category as well. Now, all of that being said, it's important for all of us that are doing it to make sure that we continue to just bottle good shit, because if we don't do that, then there's nothing to be done. But I like to think that we do.
Yeah, so far so good.
Yeah, I'm drinking it, and I got a lot of bottles behind me.
I'm not going to dive as deep as Chris did and Susannah did. And I just wanted to say that, to me, and I'll start with it, what's in my glass is what matters. And what's in my glass is, and I don't mind the color, by the way, this is 12 years old single cask of Fukano, which is my favorite expression. It was matured in the Richard European oak. And don't make me jealous, Mr. Uhde. Mine is better. But I just wanted to say that we kind of live in a very interesting times. I'm all for diversity. Going from just single malt Scotch whiskey, maybe Irish whiskey, some blends, whatever else, to be able to offer some other stuff. And I think the times that we live very interesting, because look at the M&H distillery out of Tel Aviv. They created their own rules and they follow their own rules. And bringing the whiskeys from Japan into the United States makes me feel like we're part of the history. I mean, if the rules change, they will change, hopefully for better, and hopefully all these, small distilleries and families will still be able to make their money and do what they like to do, producing a great spirit. So whatever it is, I'm going to finish with the saying, what's in my glass, that's most important. So, and I enjoy it, and I think a lot of people enjoy it as well.
Yeah, I want to just add on to that as a person who doesn't sell this, but drinks it and writes about it and likes to tell people about it. I think that's the first place to start. What's in your glass? Do you like it? Is it good? Do you want to keep drinking it? But something that adds to it for me, and I think for a lot of very passionate whiskey lovers, is the transparency, knowing about what's in your glass. And that's something that Fukano and Ohishi as brands have never, it's always been very clear, made from rice, right on the bottle, product of Japan, right? So the semantics of whether or not we want to even call it Japanese whiskey hardly matter, because the information is on there. I would like to see, I'm going to make a suggestion now, since I have you all in the same place, talk more about the Koji on the back label, maybe, or make that a little bit more of the branding of these, because I think that's that's a really important, that's the key part of the story in a lot of ways. That's you know, making these as distinct and special as they are. So
do you
with
think
that,
I'm sorry to interrupt, Suzanne, but do you think
yeah.
the koji is more important than the rice from a story perspective?
I think it's going to become more important because we are seeing there's already a barley koji whiskey on the U.S. market now, and Chris alluded to some potential non-rice koji whiskeys that ImpEx might bring in. So I think as that category expands, right, that it's a whiskey made with koji from Japan, but it's not always going to be rice. Yeah, I think maybe broadening it to talk about koji, or you know, alternatively just narrowing the focus to koji first and grain second, is probably going to be where this goes, right? Because if you want to, I mean, I feel for the guy who's bringing in the barley koji whiskey. He's going to be the only one on the shelf with that, you know, kind of style, if we want to call it that. But if if I were a retailer and a salesperson came in and said, look, I have this barley whiskey from Japan, it's made with koji, and you know, we think it's great. I haven't tried it, so I actually, I'm just, this is a hypothetical, but if I were the retailer, I'd say, well, let me try it. Okay, oh well, look, this is, you know, this is great, this is interesting, this is different, it reminds me a little bit of those rice whiskeys I have. I think I'll put it there, you know, like in the unique Japanese whiskey section, not the hibiki blends, not the Nika coffee malts, but you know, these other more esoteric offerings for the kind of consumer who's going to come in looking for that, right? Who's a little bored with the same old labels, who wants to try something different from Japan. So yeah, that was a long-winded way of saying I think koji is going to become a more important part of the conversation. It will supersede rice. Rice will still be important, as Chris was saying. You know, so someone asked about that texture, the rice or the koji, and I think it's at least partly the rice, but the koji is itself so special and so unique.
So I'm down with that, actually. I like that thought process quite a bit, right? Because you know, to be inclusive is a great thing, and it is something that ties them together, right? The barley koji whiskey and the Fukano and the Ohishi. It's a great way to, Mike.
Kojified.
It's a great way to kind of tie it together. It's you know, yeah, it's pretty cool. From our perspective, I can speak that we did have those conversations back in 2014. And the reason why we stuck with, it was a pretty big hill to climb with just the rice, because when we were first coming to market, you know, that was, a lot of people were like, you can't even make whiskey from rice. And I was like, well, we were like, yeah, you know what, Jim Beam did it, and so did Buffalo Trace. And by golly, if they can do it, we should be allowed to do it as well. And so, and so that was kind of like it's baby steps, right? And getting, look, I love whiskey with all my heart. I always will. But there is some entrenched opinions about what whiskey can and cannot be, and they are dug in pretty deep. And so it's to get those pillars to get that fence to widen out. It's just a slow process. And I think now, actually, Susannah, you're dead on as far as it being time for that to be explored more. So I got good news for you, because there is, I don't know if you guys surf the TTB websites, but there are 2 single cask nation casks coming in, and on the very front of them it says Japanese koji whiskey. So
nice.
So it's already happening. And and we've always used in our education with people who ask deeper questions. We've like you and I have talked about it for years, Susannah. We've always talked about the koji side of things. But as far as writing for a consumer to see, we probably could have been a little bit quicker to that. But it's starting now, because it seems like there's a lot more education. And so there you go.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't beat yourself up when you brought these in. You were a first mover. There was another rice whiskey brand, but that also doesn't talk about koji, by the way, and barely talks about rice in its branding and packaging. You know, it was a brand new category, so you had to start somewhere. And starting with rice is a grain, and it can be used to make whiskey. It was a good place to start because there were lots of people who didn't think about it that way. But you've done a great job of creating a category and a space on the shelf and creating awareness in people's minds that that these products exist, and now you can take them a few steps further down the path and just keep building it.
Yeah, let's I see Alex posted that he's talking about Takamine 8. Yeah, Alex, that's one of the barley ones for sure, and it's good. I like it. I've tried it.
Also, Alex had mentioned earlier on when we were talking about kosher delis using the koji. He did mention that it's Parv AF, which I think means as a Frenchman. I could be wrong. I think that's what the AF stands for. So there's some questions coming in that I want to get to in a little bit, but before we do that, just sticking with this theme of koji and the idea of koji whiskey. And Susannah, I really liked what you said before, where right now the story, or to date, at least in modern thought, the idea around koji whiskey has not been focused on the koji. Koji has been focused on the rice, but now there are other distillates that are like the barley in koji, and some American producers using koji and so on. And so, Chris, as you're trying to push this forward to ensure that this category is not only recognized, but is codified, I think, in a way so that these 875 or 825 remaining distilleries remain distilleries, right, and don't close. Are you an island here? Are there other producers that have your back as you try to sort of fight for this category?
Well, I like to think that you know, like that Takamine whiskey coming in is kind of, I would like to think that we can, you know, like we're kind of thinking on the same wavelength. I would hope that we're with new products coming into market, kind of celebrating the same style of fermentation that it's happening, right? Does that make sense? I think some people would, as far as having my back in Japan or having our back in Japan, it's yeah, of course there's people over there who kind of want to see it happen. Whether or not it's going to happen is again, it's going to be up to them, right? It's not a place for us to poke our nose. But surely, right? Like when you've got, you know, I've personally been in a store with Oisan where a couple of Japanese people recognized him and came up and they thanked him for starting to bottle his stuff as whiskey, because they were on vacation in Hawaii and they were like, we just love it. And they had we were doing an in-store demo and they literally had a box full of it that they were going to take and then leave with it, right? So that's, I mean, it's the best compliment you can get. And then I'm seeing in the posts where people are talking about the different experiences they have within the whiskey, which is really cool as well. So I think it's again just in its infancy, right? It's 4 years in whiskey, like, well, really it's 7 now, right? Because we 2014, first two were just figuring out how to get it here within compliance, but 7 years of whiskey is nothing. And now with like other ones coming in, great. Like it just raises awareness, and luckily for us, you know, we're of the opinion that our stuff is up top tier, so it's perfect, right? Someone gets to know one and love it, and then they get to know us and love us too, so that they can have 2 bottles on their bar instead of just 1. Well, I'll tell you what I like to do. I like to A/B them. So I take my malt, and I take my koji stuff, and I take my malts. I can't do this, but I do A/Bs, right? I take a sip of one and I take a sip of another, and it's a great way to experience the difference between the two. You kind of like when you take like you have your dinner in front of you and you're like, I'll have a bite of this time. Now I'll have a bite of this. And it's kind of fun to play with that way.
Susannah, I think you had mentioned earlier on when we were talking about who is on this committee of people writing these laws. And Chris, you had said, well, you know, Suntory and Nika are on it. Now, Suntory have a rice whiskey in their portfolio now, don't they? Didn't they buy a distillery 2019, 2020?
They did buy a shochu distillery, yeah.
A shochu distillery, but are they bottling it as whiskey? I mean,
I don't know the answer.
I don't know if I'm going down a weird rabbit hole here, but
they did a whiskey called the Essence of Suntory. That was released in, I want to say, August of last year, and it's good. I've tried it too. They did a Sakura cast finish with it, and it was a lot of fun. Okay. So that was not gonna lie, for everyone that gave me hell about, or I keep saying me, for everyone that gave us hell, because again, Sam's all quiet, but the fact of the matter is, like, I'm gambling with his money, right? Everyone that gave us hell, and Sam doesn't gamble, so it's kind of like I said, it's, you know, there's a story about, anyways, it's like this big foundation from which I can kind of tap dance on, because I know if I'm on the foundation, if I stray off the foundation, I can't tap dance anymore, because I know it's not a good idea. As long as I'm on the foundation, then it gives me the bravery to kind of tap dance on it. So everyone that gave us hell about the rice being a grain and used in, especially in a Japanese whiskey, when they're like, you can't make a Japanese whiskey from rice. Well, when Suntory does it, and you know they're the number one in the category for as far as power, then you're like, well, hey man, where's my apology? But they print apologies on page 7, don't they? Does that make sense? Like, it was a good feeling to see it, because one, the whiskey that they made was delicious. Two, it was like, this is what we were talking about, right? Like, it's, you know, this is what we were talking about. Like, just relax, pour some in your glass and relax. It's fun. Don't sit there and say no, can't. Yes, can. And if we take that approach, like, look how it branches out, and everyone can embrace it and have more fun with it.
Well, and this is why I brought it up, right? If Suntory are coming out with it and they are the biggest player, then that's a statement. And I think that's a pretty big statement. And if the whiskey is good, that's an even stronger statement for them to be making. And you know, hopefully, with them being on that committee, they'll try to put some power behind that to ensure that Koji whiskey is protected, and so that those 825 other distilleries don't turn into 800 distilleries and 775 distilleries and so on.
It's a great feeling to be pioneers, and when you're followed by someone, that's fine, but when you're followed by Suntory, makes you feel double proud. And I remember, speaking of risk, you know, Elijah mentioned the cask number 1257. That was a non-age statement sherry matured Ohishi, and I remember that, and we sent it to some, you know, reviewers and bloggers, and we were like, what are we gonna get, 70 or 80? Or we got 92 and A, and now this, you know, everyone's hunting for this specific release. And actually, I would like to have one too, because I run out of them. That makes, you know, a big win, a feeling of you know, that we did something right. So I remember that probably deserves a special page in this ImpEx book.
Yeah, we sold that one too cheap for sure. That's kind of the biggest. Actually, there's your biggest. I think that's the biggest statement. I think that's the biggest statement, right? Like Sam Filmus, who can drink whatever he wants, is he's running out of the Ohishi bottles because he's drinking them instead of keeping them in his closet. I love it.
Because his partner didn't think about Sam liking this particular whiskey, but that's okay. That's a different story.
And I think it was Elijah that mentioned cask 1257. Elijah, I got you covered. I have a bottle. I'll send you a sample. There's a question that came in from Bill Myers, and I thought it was an interesting one. You had mentioned that distillery in Peoria, Illinois. Is it any relation to Clark's Rye?
I don't know about Clark's Rye, but funnily enough, the distillery is called the Manhattan Distillery. So if Clark's Rye was done in the Manhattan Distillery, then that's where it is.
Okay, there you go. And then there was a question from Michael Taylor wanted, seeing as we were talking about the Koji holiday, we need a Koji mascot. I appreciate
Oh my God,
that.
I haven't looked that up. That's a great question.
What would a Koji mascot look like?
Koji-chan.
You've seen
Reveal-
all the wonderful mascots of Japan. I saw one the other day. It was like so and so is a melted ice spirit or something, he's like an abandoned ice sprite trying to get home before he fully melts. It's just like a cute looking sort of whitish silvery flesh thing. I really hope there's a Koji mascot. All right, I'm in front of my phone. I'm not going to be Googling, but I'm going to check after this, or anyone who's got a browser window can search.
Just keep searching for Koji mascot day after day after day, and someone will do a search for popular Google search terms, and it'll become a thing, self-fulfilling prophecy.
If there is not already a Koji mascot, like boom, free premium idea for you guys. Just get someone to design a little Koji mascot. Have it cast in plastic, put it on a little string, and it goes around the neck of every bottle.
Koji-chan. We would get in trouble for advertising to kids if we put them on the bottles.
Oh,
it was cute.
That.
Make it not cute then. Make it act. I mean, it's a fungus.
Yeah, make it. Yeah, like Krampus. Yeah, or whatever. We've got a question here from Joshua Gershon Feldman, dear friend, lovely gentleman.
Hey.
He loves his Ohishi bottles that he has opened. He loves the sherry influence. Any other experimentations going on beyond sherry and bourbon for Ohishi?
So there are all types. Chris, further down in the comments, talks about Sakura and Mizunara. Yeah.
You can't read it, but
Isla Cask, yeah.
Isla Cask has definitely been one of our favorites because it's like a kiss of Isla. It's like the segue drug to get you to fall down that rabbit hole. So, not just with Ohishi, but also like if we talk about the Matsui stuff, the Matsui did some Sakura and Mizunara cast stuff, and Matsui's single malt, the Mizunara, won a whole bunch of awards across a lot of different platforms, which was really cool. And it's less than 3 years old, so that's kind of awesome. On the Ohishi side, I'll try to list off as many different barrel profiles that are going at once. And so they've done Acacia cask, New Oak, Banyuls, Muscatel, sherry, different ages of sherry. So like 12-year-old Oloroso casks and 75-year-old Oloroso casks. So they would have had to hold the Oloroso in there for that amount of time to qualify, because we all know about seasoned casks now where they do like 1 to 5 years. So 12-year-old Oloroso, 75-year-old Oloroso. Then you've got port cask, Madeira cask. I'm going to pour some of this in a second. This is
that one is phenomenal.
He did a couple of rum casks. Those ended up getting filtered down and sold as shochus in Japan. So those weren't bottled as whiskeys. I got drunk as piss off a New Oak cask in an omakase place. But then Banyuls, I think I said, Sakura, Mizunara. I think there's a little bit of red wine going on. Fukano has a lot of red wine casks. We use those in the different editions, like Fukano 2020 and Fukano 2021. Both will have red wine influence into them. Mm-hmm. Then there is, we said Isla cask. That might kind of cover it. There's
That's amazing. That's 9 different cask styles, and just the sherry alone, you've got at least 2 different there between the 12 and the 75-year-old. That's and just as a whiskey drinker, do you like what's going on there? Are some of those still kind of wait and see for you?
So when Japan opens back up, Sam and I were supposed to go in we're all set. We're actually all set to take the team in the spring of 2020, and then all the lockdowns happened. Well, like that was in the planning stages. But the second it opens up, I'm dragging his backside over there for I think a week, and we're just gonna at least and time so that we can just take a week. And look, I'm in trouble now. And we're gonna go in and just yes, it's because Oisan is probably, Oisan is a great partner to have in the portfolio in that he loves whiskey. He actually so I bring him bottles of whiskey when we go to Japan, and IPA beer. He loves West Coast IPAs, but I'll bring him a bunch of bottles. I'll bring him some bottles of whiskey as well, and I'll bring him a bunch of sample bottles of whiskey as well. And he's young, he's experimental, and he's basically tried everything that's been made available to him. So he'll send me a line message saying, "Hey, this type of cask came onto it. Do you think it sounds cool?" And my reply is, "Yeah, I think that does sound cool. Can we get some?" And his reply is always like, "I already bought X amount of casks of it to see." Just to see. And there's been some re-racking of stuff, some stuff that were like, it's been a really fun journey because the Mizunara, for example, it showed a whole bunch of Mizunara after just a few months, and then it got quiet. And then once it went over the 12-month cycle, it started to show a whole bunch of influence on it again. So it was like this, it was like really a lot of peak, and then it troughed, and then it went up to a lot of peak again, and it was really cool. Whereas another one, the Sakura cask, it takes a while. It's not overnight. You have to let that sit in for a full 12 months before you get the nuance of the Sakura oak, because if you just let it sit in for a few months, it gets a bitter quality that's not necessarily desirable. But after 12 months, it turns a corner and it gets to be really, really pretty.
Goes to show maturing is not a linear thing. You're not. It's not going to be like this, and as you keep going up, it's just going to get better and better. It could take turns and go in directions you don't expect. We've got a question here from Mark Pruitt. Opportunities for consumers to interact with the brands and the product.
So let's talk about that for a second. One is the interpretation is a factor, right? So I don't speak Japanese, and when we bring in interpreters, when you start to add filters, it makes it a little bit difficult. We've done some with Oisan. He's great at it. So we can explore that for sure. And maybe we should look at that for another edition of this later on. We just have to plan it out a little bit more. For Fukano whiskey, well, guess what? You have the master blender, I don't like saying that word, the primary blender on from right now. So what can I answer for you? Surprise, it's a white guy.
This may be... I don't know if this is a weird rabbit
Here's what it
hole
looks like in COVID, by the way.
Yeah.
You have all these different things that are shipped over, and it's just a nightmare trying to get it done. But
I love, though, that Oi-san and Fukano-san both allow you to do the blending, that they're trusting you to put their brand in the direction that you see fit. That's got to be just a shit ton of pressure on you. Yeah?
Well, no, actually. I mean, yes.
It wasn't until now, Josh.
Yeah. Well, no, it was at first, right? So I mean, so let's take it a step back. One is, let's take a look at the support system, right? I've got Sam right next to me. So nothing comes in without him trying it as well. So I've got my solid second opinion that I know I can count on no matter what, right? So if there's ever any doubt, like he does not mess around. So if something isn't quite where it needs to be, he speaks up pretty quickly about it. That's A. B, Oisan does his own now. So there was a little bit of getting to know you as far as that goes, because it's definitely engineered more towards a Westerner's palate, but also towards an Asian palate as well. And there's a little bit of finagling to go there because of the difference in the diets. And but Oisan's we gave him some samples of what was working effectively for this market, and he took that and he said, okay, I've got this. And he totally does have it. So there is we have some input on certain things, and then on other things it's running on autopilot now. So it's pretty cool for that fun. On the Fukano side, the way that came about was, again, yes, there was a lot of pressure there for sure, but and I'll go into this with everyone who's still watching this, because it's actually kind of it's a real thing that I think a lot of people deal with who try to put releases together. But so it started out where, when we were talking to them about the project, what they said was, if you were going to do it, how would you do it? And we replied with, well, if we were going to do it, we would do it this way. And so they said, okay, go do that. And they tracked well. And so on the second one, again, we were like, if we were going to do it, we would do it this way. And Fukano-san says, yeah, just go for it. It looks like it's working. And then luckily, the reviews came in that were really good. Whiskey Advocate, gave us top 20 on the 2017 release. We got a bunch of good reviews from other folks as well. And then it got to be the point where I think 2018 is when Fukano-san, we were drinking at the Daily Pint in Santa Monica. Yeah, that was a fun night. And and he basically says, it's okay for you to say that you guys do this. And that was cool, but still it's not part of the marketing or anything until a question like that comes up. But so then we just took it and ran with it. And there were a couple of things that were more pressure than others, as far as like, there was a parcel of casks that we kind of needed to take them to make it all work. And so there was a finagling of trying to determine, like there was one gunpowder cask. So basically it was, it's a love or hate thing. Someone like Elijah probably would have just absolutely loved it. Some other folks would have absolutely hated it. A gunpowder cask.
Yeah.
So like a sherried cask that's got, some people would say it's gunpowder or sulfur.
Oh,
right?
okay. Yeah. Sulfur cask.
I say gunpowder because sulfur is like, it's not sulfur. It doesn't smell like sulfur. It kind of is in that area, but it was more of a gunpowder cask, like burnt gunpowder.
Yep.
And we had to add an extra 1,200 liters of other casks to the thousands of liters that cask was already going into, to balance it all out, because it was such a lopsided doodah that it just took over any of the vats that you put it in. So you really had to thin it out a bunch. But when you did thin it out, it gave the whiskey this beautiful finish where it just kind of came in on the back end, just a little bit to get you thinking about it. And that was the Fukano Vault 1. And then the other nervous part was, how far do you push the envelope, right? Because, again, when we approach this, we think about it as, you do some stuff for straight up people who like more Western engineered whiskeys, right? And then the other part of it, you want to celebrate what it actually is. Like, it's made from sake rice. It's got this umami characteristic to it. It pairs well with Japanese cuisine, so you want to celebrate that as well. So we'll shift it out to where it kind of, one release might be super. Well, I can tell you, like, the Fukano editions are usually softer and more rosy and lighter and kind of more subtle in the way that they're done. But then you have the Fukano 10-year, which is like oak and butter, right? And it's oak butter umami, and it's two very different whiskeys. Where, again, if you put them back into that whole the rye, rum, Scotch tasting that I talked about earlier, if you had all of those in there as blinds as well, I don't think you'd associate them with the same distillery. But it's fun to do it that way, and luckily Fukano-san allows us to do it that way because he trusts us to do it. So there's the philosophy behind it. Now, is that nerve-wracking? It can be, because every time you push that envelope, you want to be accepted and you want folks to kind of like it, but you realize you might be pushing them a little hard to get their heads wrapped around it. But hindsight being 2020, it's like we've had great responses, so it's not so nerve-wracking anymore. 2021 is going to be fun, right? Because those were done via that. Normally I'll spend my time in Japan locking it in, and then I'll come back to the United States, and then we'll sign off on it after it's back here as a final edition. But this all had to be done with samples being shipped. So the barrels had to be tapped, samples shipped out, then we had to put it together, and then everything had to get racked. And so it's going to be, but I think luckily, at the long story longer, basically we're fortunate in that all the casks are usually really good. So it's kind of hard to muck it up. But you never know.
Well, Chris, I think you're being a little bit humble here. To get a distillery to trust you enough to let you in the warehouse and play with their casks, and then put their name on this blend or on the single cask that you decided to bottle the single cask, it's a big deal. It's a big deal. And so far, it's your fault that we're out of Fukano constantly. All I can say.
Sorry. Yeah, that is my fault.
There's some more questions coming in, but there was this is from Jose Milk, and I can talk to this one. So what Jose is asking about, there was a single cask of Ohishi that I sold to a shop here in Connecticut called Ancana's, and I remember bringing the samples to them, and I got to taste the samples ahead of time, and I think there were 4, and there was this one that just absolutely stood out. And it's right, you're in that situation where you say, here are your samples, and you put the one you like just a little closer to them in the hopes that that's the one they pick. And they ended up picking that one. But the reason why it stood out so much, so I think it was about 9 years old, something like that, and it was from Refill Sherry. But it tasted like a liquid Walker's shortbread cookie. It was just so buttery and a little salty and decadent, and so they call it the cookie. So if you look at Ancana's in Connecticut and you search for Ohishi or you search for the cookie, you'll find it, and it's a remarkable little whiskey. I've purchased a few bottles just to gift to friends because it's a glorious little whiskey.
I remember that cask because that was when that was in the early days for sure. So the time waiting to see which one they chose was always like, you're sitting there going, come on guys, pick one. And then sure enough, the cookie happened. He's also talking about Madeira here, and there was a Madeira cask done as well. And that was the SCWC one. And that's this one here basically. And
yeah,
that's basically, anyways, there's a few casks of that over in Japan still, and we still have them on reserve, so there'll be more of that coming soon. But I remember that sugar cookie cask for Ancana's. It was yeah, that was a good one.
And then we had from I liked this, and it kind of tied into what you were saying before, Susannah. This is from Johnny at Whiskey and Donuts. More koji and rice info on the labels and packaging would be amazing. But this brings up a logistical question, right? You're dealing with a third-party agency, the TTB. How much would you like to put on, and how much do you think they would allow you to put on if you really tried to get into the nitty-gritty of koji?
I think the TTB has opened up quite a bit since the early days. Like they if you look at like the single cask nation labels, for example, or the ImpEx collection labels, they were approved pretty easily. So I don't necessarily think that would be a problem. I can speak to what the problem actually is that a lot of these are they're hand labeled, and so and they're hand labeled, and they are like the ABVs written by hand on a whole chunk of them. So yeah. I don't know if anyone's ever noticed that, but you look and it's always different. And it's a matter of the dry goods bit aligning with, I mean, we could probably do a shift on the back label for sure, but the front labels are printed in pretty large quantities. And we did that to make sure that we could, like, again, it's shop talk, but to make sure we could get the paper quality we wanted at the price that we needed. Because when you start to do small runs, it gets kind of cost prohibitive. And so we did larger runs with the idea of being able to bottle out more. And so there's a little backlog of the bottling because, like Sam said, we're short on the Fukano stuff. And on the Ohishi stuff, we're a little backlogged there too. So it's something that can happen. It's just a matter of, you know, when to make it happen, because right now it's probably more important to make sure that we're satisfying the requests that we're having for the product versus getting the other part out there. But it's it's definitely heard and definitely going to be incorporated. It's just a matter of redoing the TTB labels, because it might be a Helen question where if we can still use the old label once we get the new one done to try to use up the old label. It's a weird spot to be in.
There are always workarounds, that, I mean, redoing the label, yeah. But, in the meantime, on the websites for the whiskeys, just, because the URL, well, the URL on the back label of this Fukano is ImpEx Bev, but if impexbev.com just, wanted to include a section that says, curious about Koji, learn more here. You could start to work around and provide an outlet for people who want to know. But I'm glad that Whiskey and Donuts agrees. I do think it's a good idea to give people, let's say, the option of getting more into the story of Koji. They don't necessarily have to. They can just pick up the bottle, enjoy it, and go no further, and that's great. But providing an avenue for engagement with that particularly unique part of the production process and the story of these whiskeys, I think can only have positive benefits.
So we're all on board with you, because the ImpEx collection 17-year-old stuff as well will say Japanese Koji whiskey on it. So we got your back, girl.
I bet you TTB approved all these three labels only because they had no idea. But I agree with you, Susannah. If we start, and you will see it appear on our website and everywhere else, I want to be as transparent as possible. But I think it's great even for marketing purposes, because people will ask what Koji is, what does it do to the whiskey, what part of the process is taking place to. So I think it's good from all perspectives. But we heard it loud and clear.
Just out of curiosity, Sam, was in 2014 when you were looking at this, and I imagine it was something Chris brought to you, was there trepidation? I mean, at that time you were not co-business owners. You were the owner. Was there trepidation, and it was just a situation of, what, I believe in Chris. I believe in what he's got here. The whiskey is good. Let's see what it could be. What was your feeling back then?
I've been hunting for Japanese whiskeys about 5 years before we, actually started talking to Chris about that, or he started talking to me about it. And because all these single malt Scotch whiskey tastings we did, I would say people would approach and ask, when you bring in Japanese whiskey. So I started naively, getting a hold of some distillers, and I had no success at all. Like, my emails were ignored left and right. And then all of a sudden Chris goes, I'm dating this Japanese girl, and we have some serious thoughts about it and all this stuff. And then the wedding happens, and then it happened to be that Chris would probably not admit it, but I still think, or I want to believe, that it's Kumiko's dad who inspired, or don't know if he made the connection, but there's something there that in my mind, I want to believe in that. And all of a sudden he comes to me saying, I've got a connection, and I will start bringing the Japanese whiskey. And I said, well, it's great. You beat me on that, man. I could not get it done. And I said, it's good because you've been working for me for about 12 years at that time, or 10 years, something like that. And I said, it's good for you to, kind of pursue your own way. And, good luck to you. I'll help you with it. He goes, no, stop. I want you to be my partner, and I'm going to bring the Japanese portfolio into your portfolio, and then we're going to make a great company. So that's basically what happened. One of us must have had a lot of vodka at that time, or some other spirits. Just happened.
Says the Russian guy. Okay, I get it.
So Sam is actually right there about, it was Kumiko who allowed for, Kumiko was really the one who helped kind of bring it all together, because again, me being me, like I'm not exactly socially apt in any country settings. So she definitely rounded out the rough edges so that there was trust there with the distilleries. So that was useful.
Yeah.
And I want to add that well, at least one of these distillers got screwed by some American importer, which is very shame in all of us that it happened. And Chris and Kumiko probably were kind of able to kind of cross that bridge and did get some trust from this people. So that's a big deal. I know it's cultural, and I know there's a lot of sentimental things about that, but we proved that we're good payees and hopefully good people behind their brands.
Yeah. We've got just about 5 minutes here. The question came in from Vlad Dubes, Vlad VD, and I'm hoping we can spend a little time on this. And I think it's a very interesting question. So I'm going to pop this up here, right? Koji whiskey. Sounds a bit strange, as if koji is an ingredient such as barley, yeast, and rice. Before you say anything, I would suggest that when we talk about whiskey, and the mantra has always been, well, whiskey, there's 3 ingredients, right? The grains, the yeast, the water. But I would suggest that the cask is also an ingredient. The cask helps dictate where that flavor is going to go. And so let's incorporate whiskey into that same thought process. Is it something that should be more recognized in the cask when the cask really isn't talked about as an ingredient, or would you put it in the category of the cask where it does help dictate where the flavor goes?
I would kick that question to Susannah because she has a much broader knowledge of whiskey as a whole, so she can talk about enzymes and everything. And I think she's the one who can really speak to that because, please.
Yeah, I don't, is it an ingredient? Is it not? I guess it depends on your perspective on what an ingredient is. But I'll say this: there are many whiskey styles that include more than grain, yeast, and water and cask. I mean, I kind of agree that the cask should be considered an ingredient, or maybe it's a garnish. I don't know, but you go to a number of bourbon distilleries. They're not going to tell you this on the tour, but they're adding enzymes, to their mash that helps with fermentation. You go to larger distilleries and you see them adding nitrogen into the fermenters to beef up the NADV, right? To increase the yield of their fermentations. These things are legal in the places where these whiskeys are made. They might not be legal when you're making single malt Scotch, but they're definitely legal in other whiskey styles. And the Eurocentric and the Scotch-centric point of view that there can only be it's a bit like the German beer purity laws. Beer can only include grain, hops, and water. I think, which yes, unless you're a Hefeweizen or any number of other exceptions, and the beer purity laws are pretty roundly, I think, misused in contemporary times by people with some weird agenda. I think this. I don't know. I really don't like the exclusionary Eurocentric view of whiskey can only be these 3 ingredients, and it must be aged 3 years, and the cask must be made of oak, and it cannot be more than 700 liters. And that's the American in me. Like I want to see the restrictions and boundaries on whiskey blown wide open. I'm not saying it's a total free for all. I think there are like ground rules everyone can agree on, but it doesn't have to. We don't have to agree on the most restrictive ground rules, or certainly we should allow for producers with creativity or with 1,200 years of distilling with koji behind them culturally to continue in their paths and the way they are doing things. I think it would be a really big mistake for Westerners to come in and say this koji whiskey isn't whiskey because koji is not an allowed ingredient in whiskey by our rules. Well, you don't make all the rules just because you know you grew up on single malt scotch and cut your teeth on that.
Yep.
I think that would be extremely short-sighted, you know, at best, and far worse, you know, potentially. So I don't know if that's an answer to the question. Is koji an ingredient? Yeah, I would say so, and you know, and an important one to the soul of these whiskeys.
Well, let me just really quickly, we're kind of hit our time, but I think what you're talking about here ties in really lovely to Joshua Gershon-Feldman's follow-up question that, you know, I know Chris punted that question over to you. You might be able to talk a little bit further on the sciencey part of this when it refers to Ohishi and Fukano, but if it's an ingredient, right? I'm gonna front load that. Does it perform any of the fermentation, or is it yeast that does it? Is koji just adding the flavor? Like,
No,
what is that
does,
koji doing?
So real quick, to take it back to the last question, I really like that answer, and I think it is an ingredient in as far as like a Scottish larch washback is an ingredient with the other microbials that'll live around in there in between fermentation times, right? Like you talked about the cask after, the cask before as well would kind of qualify because it's a modifier onto the final product. Now, yes, koji does ferment. So like basically remember koji, now here's where it gets a little bit outside of what I know. But koji absolutely ferments because it's how you use it to pickle things, right? So you sprinkle it onto soybeans to kind of make your soy sauce, or you use it to ferment whatever type of food it is you're trying to. It's a preservative, and from what I've been told on the grains, it kind of acts. It gives that umami and quality to it, but it also adds there is a little bit of alcohol that is produced. Now, whether it's going to produce or not, again, that goes outside, because I would imagine if it would, they wouldn't need to pitch the yeast, but they pitch the yeast, so that definitely has some stuff there to it. So if you're talking about just like straight fermentation, if you're talking about ethanol production, then that's where I'm not exactly 100% sure, but it definitely ferments and changes whatever it's latched onto in a lot of ways. And that would, for me, would qualify as fermentation. Make sense?
Yeah.
So
it starts as saccharification and then continues. It's like a co-ferment almost with the yeast, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's how I understand it. You're sprinkling it on to start that conversion of starches to sugars, but then after whatever the first 24 hours, the yeast is added, and it's the moromi, right? First moromi, second moromi, and that's fermentation process going on. It's co-fermenting koji and yeast.
Yep.
And that's you know, one of the beautiful things about that is, and Chris, you talked about it earlier on, where you know, these distilleries aren't using copper pot stills and doing a double distillation because they need to clean the spirit, and they can only take a very small segment of that spirit. The koji seems to be doing something to the fermentation that allows them to do a single distillation in a stainless steel, no copper needed, and everything from heads, hearts, and tails is just all usable, delicious spirit. So that koji is like, it's working overtime and then some for these spirits.
Yeah, it's fun times with Tim Grimes.
Well, I like that. So Susannah, weird and wonderful.
those are Josh's usual adjectives for me. Weird and wonderful.
This has been a really enlightening conversation. Susannah, you brought wonderful questions and just wonderful insight into production and thought behind production. I really appreciate it. Sam, you did the wonderful job of being the quiet man when you needed to be the quiet man, but opened your mouth when you needed to open your mouth. Always. Vlad had asked, "Is this recorded?" Yes, Vlad, and for anybody else who may have shown up late, or maybe you want to share this with a friend, this will always be available on Facebook. If you go to the ImpEx Beverages page, this will also be available on the ImpEx Beverages YouTube page as well. So you can always go back and pour a few drams and catch up or share it with friends. Did any of you have any closing comments before I tell our viewers of the next and final distillery deep dive?
Yeah, just the last thing I would say is we spent a lot of time talking about koji, but I'm a huge fan of the pure malts. I'm a huge fan of Japanese blends. I'm a really, really big fan of Japanese single malts. And, you know, if you are new to the category at all, if you happen to watch this and you really haven't explored that space, I highly recommend exploring that space. Even some of the more expensive bottles that seem like they're prohibitive, like they're worth the investment on both the single malt side and on the pure malt side from us and from all the other companies as well, because there is a really cool thing happening right now, and it is changing, and it's, I think if you can afford to do it, if you can enter that space with you or your club and you can realize what's going on now, it's going to be fun to look back on this in 5 years and see where everything is and see how it's changed, because it'll have changed in 5 years. And I know this because it's different than it was 5 years ago, and it's way different than it was 10 years ago. So please, like, make sure that, like, I don't want to sound like we come from one side. Like, this is kind of a brave new world as far as whiskey goes around the place. So just jump in the deep end of the pool and have fun with it. That's my last words.
Beautiful. Sam, Susannah?
I got nothing to add. Those were good last words.
I agree.
Well, I wanted to thank you, Joshua, for putting this. We talked about that. It's not easy, but wanted to extend some special thanks to Susannah. It's always great to see you, spend time with you. I feel like every time I learn something new, and you're amazing, all I can say. And it's a good opportunity to me to say that in front of a lot of people. And Chris, you're my hero. You'll get your kick in the back, but later on, I want to thank everyone who joined with wonderful questions and comments. And it means the world to us that you appreciate what we bring, because it is a risky side, but we're proud of what we've done for now. And that's all thanks to you who trust in what we do.
Beautiful. Just going to throw on one little bit of information for you and for the viewers. The next ImpEx Distillery Deep Dive, actually, we won't be focusing specifically on distilleries, but I guess in a way we will be focusing on distilleries. The final one is going to be a focus on independent bottlers. So we will have Ollie Chilton of Single Malts of Scotland with us. We will have Alex Bruce of Adelphi with us. Of course, Sam, Chris, you'll be here to talk and maybe share some information about I'm not going to touch too much on it, but a new brand to the ImpEx portfolio. And then we'll have Jason Johnston Yellen here as well from Single Cask Nation. Of course, me from Single Cask Nation. And it is going to be an independent bottlers geek fest. So should be good fun. And that'll be June 2nd, same bat time, same bat channel. And we'll be sharing the links with everybody. Thank you all. Susannah, so lovely to see you. Chris, Sam, I get to see you guys all the time. I get to hear your voice all the time, but I don't get to see Susannah nearly as enough.
Yeah. This was such a pleasure. Gosh, I mean, I've missed seeing all of you in person, but I've really just missed like having chat and whiskey at the same time. And I'm touched and delighted and honored that you asked me to be a part of this. So thank you so much. Please invite me again. I'll come back anytime.
Beautiful. We're going to hold you to that because the series isn't over. There'll be a third version and a fourth version. We're going to make sure of that. So thank you. To everybody who's viewing, thank you all for sticking around. Thank you all for pouring a couple drams, joining us, learning. We will see you on June 2nd. Enjoy your May until then. Take care, everybody.
Cheers, guys.
Cheers.